In our last episode, I talked about how the Moody Blues really changed their sound between their first album and their second album. But we didn't really get into what that really meant. And that's what we're going to do in this episode, because you see, what they did is they defied their record company, and they decided to go against the record company's wishes and make an album that they wanted to make, which was dramatically different from their first album and their hit Go Now, which really kind of was like their only hit. So the record company had this grand design that they needed to come up with something that was a surefire hit. The Moodies had a totally different idea. So let's figure out where they went. Let's go back and visit the days of future past. Yeah, let's drop the needle. Their contract with Decca is about to expire. But Decca has created a new label called Durham Records. And so they approach the Moody Blues and say, if you guys will do a rock and roll version of a classical song, a suite, we will relieve all of the debt that you have with the record company. But the Moodies had a different idea. Rather than doing that classical piece, they wanted to do their own original material. The London Festival Orchestra was hired to play the orchestral movements for this record. Now, the record label had no idea that the Moodies were not recording the piece that the record company had demanded. And they didn't know anything about it until the Moodies gave them the finished album with their new material on it. And of course, that album is called Days of Future Past. The record is a concept album tracking the day of a life of an everyman, with original songs relating to different parts of the day, performed in chronological order, introduced and interspersed with orchestral music. Considering all 5 members of the Moodies wrote these songs before the concept was really fleshed out, it's amazing how they all fit so well together. Despite being a very lush concept album, it is amazing that the Moodies and the orchestra never ever played together. The Moodies would record their song, and then those tapes would be given to the orchestra, who would then record their passages to go along with it. Here's the everyday person's life as envisioned by the Moody Blues on this album. And the concept holds up through the entire album. It starts as dawn, goes to lunchtime, on to the afternoon, Tuesday afternoon, then in the evening, and finally the night. Classic songs now include Lunch Break, Peak Hour, Forever Afternoon Tuesday, and of course, Nights in White Satin. The album only had moderate success on its release, but the Moodies fulfilled their obligation and got out of debt with the record label. But my fellow disc jockeys and I on our FM radio stations in LA would play the heck out of Nights in White Satin. And it took 5 years, but 5 years later, Days of Future Past was considered a success. For the next album, things get a little trippy for the Moody Blues, because in 1968, they're heavily into drugs and very influenced by LSD. And in fact, they stayed with Timothy Leary at his ranch. And this inspired their next album. It's called In Search of the Lost Chord. I like Ride My Seesaw, Dr. Livingston, I Presume, the Ode to Timothy Leary, Legend of a Mind, and The Best Way to Travel. Although this album continues the sound of an orchestra playing with the Moodies, there is no orchestra. The London Festival Orchestra was not invited back. In fact, the Moodies are playing all of the instruments themselves, and the Mellotron is all over it. The Moodies worked really hard on the mix of this album because they wanted to make sure the instruments were placed in exactly the right place. This is an album that you should listen to with headsets, because when you put the headsets on, the instruments seem to float all around your head. The album hit number 5 in the UK and 23 in the US. After the album was released, they went on their first US tour. They played both the Fillmore and the Fillmore East, and in between toured across the US, playing gigs with Canned Heat, traveling on a school bus. 1969 is a very busy year for the Moody Blues. They released 2 albums in that year. The first one is called On the Threshold of a Dream. Again, it's a concept album, this one revolving around the cusp of a new consciousness and new enlightenment. And as with previous albums, the concept plays through the entire record. I Like Lovely to See You, Dear Diary, So Deep Within You, Are You Sitting Comfortably, and the closers, Have You Heard, Part 1 and Part 2, with A Voyage as an instrumental bridge. The album was a hit, reaching number 1 in the UK and was their first top 20 album in the US. And it stayed in the charts in the US for over 2.5 years. Later that same year, inspired by the moon landing, the Moodies released another concept album called To Our Children's Children. Mike Pinder has said that he wanted the album to allow everyone to go to the moon. Just put on your headphones and turn the volume up. Like all Moody's concept albums, it starts with narration and then segues into higher and higher. I Like Both Eyes of a Child, I Never Thought I'd Live to Be 100, Gypsy of a Strange and Distant Time, and of course, Watching and Waiting. The album reaches number 2 in the UK and number 14 in the US, making it their highest charting album in the US at that time. By this time, the music that the Moodies were making in the studio became harder and harder for them to play on stage. So they decided for their next album, they would sort of dial back the production and try to do something a little bit simpler. When making this album, the band members were getting married and having kids, and the music reflects that. The album starts with Question, which is a protest song about war. Justin Hayward says that they were influenced by their experiences interacting with Americans on their tours, and the fear and anger about the draft and the Vietnam War. I also like How It Is We Are Here, and The Tide Rushes In. Now, drummer Graham Edge offers up Don't You Feel Small, but he doesn't sing it. And then the album closes with the balance, and that's where the album gets its title from, the opening and the closing songs. The album reached number 1 in the UK and number 3 in the US. Then in 1971, they go back into the studio and release Every Good Boy Deserves Favor. The title comes from the musical notes of the treble clef, E, G, B, D, F, Every Good Boy Deserves Favor. I Like the Story in Your Eyes, After You Came, Nice to Be Here. The album continues their hot streak. Again, it's number 1 in the UK, number 2 in the US, and of course they go on tour to support it. For their next album in 1972, they decide to go back to a more lush sound, and they're going to take the stories Canterbury Tales by Chaucer and try to turn that into a concept album. And they call the album The Seventh Sojourn. But this is a very difficult album for the Moodies to make because things are not going well inside the band. Interestingly enough, calling the album Seventh Sojourn, Lodge says the Bible said that thou shalt rest on the seventh day, and the word sojourn means coming to a halt. The band needed a rest, and this is one of my least favorite Moody Blues albums. But I do like Isn't Life Strange, and I'm Just a Singer in a Rock and Roll Band. The album hit 5 in the UK and became the band's first number 1 album in the US, spending 5 weeks at the top of the chart. Following the example set by the Beatles when the Beatles created their own record label, Apple, the Moodies decide to do the same thing and create their label, which they call Threshold Records. Now, as usual, I've created a Spotify playlist where you can listen to some of the songs that I've talked about in this episode. And here's the link, and I'll also put it in the comments below. So in the period between 1967 and 1972, which is often referred to as the classical period of the Moody Blues, they go up against a record company and create an entirely new sound of the Moody Blues with Days of Future Past, and then follow it with 6 other best-selling albums, making the Moody Blues one of the best-selling groups at the time. An incredible body of work, released in just 5 years. In our next episode, we're going to look at what happens to the Moody Blues between 1978 and 2003. And yeah, hint, there's going to be a whole lot more music. So thanks for watching, and until next time, keep a rockin'. If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.